Yeah, from my side, just a very short and warm hello. It's great to see you all here in Geneva. We have met with most of you online for many times, and now we have the pleasure to interact in person. And I'm sure we will have a great program with wonderful presentations and discussions. And I would like to thank in particular the participants outside the network who joined today. Our three wonderful ladies from the international organizations, Antonia, Elizabeth, and Christiane from WTO, IOM, and ILO, respectively, who all deal with labor migration in one way or another. Antonia, of course, a bit more on the margins, but she will let you know. And actually, this connection interface with trade policy is very dear to our project, and we try to get at it at different levels, different pieces of research, which will be also presented here at the workshop. And of course, IOM and ILO is no surprise that they work on labor migration, and we are very keen to hear what your organizations respectively are doing. And we will have also the chance to hear you tonight on the public panel together with Stefan, who will keynote address. That's wonderful as well. There will be also someone from IGC who I think is not joined yet. I'm optimistic that she should already be here now, but maybe some people will be joining. We also have a representative from the Swiss Department for Migration Affairs, or State Secretariat for Migration, Mr. Renaud. Thanks for being here. Yeah, we are very happy to have this then because after all, especially labor migration is very much a national policy issue. So that's great. And we have also invited some people who do other initiatives in Switzerland to bring new migrants into the labor market, either refugees or migrants who are being reskilled, upskilled. So Yvonne Jano, who is a dear colleague also from the Swiss Center for Competence in Research on Migration from the University of Neuchâtel, and also a member of the Swiss Commission on Migration. She will tell us about how can brain waste be avoided in Switzerland. And we have Mrs. Bettina Hirsig. She's not here yet. Tomorrow morning from Power Coders, which is an initiative to upskill migrants into IT operations in particular. Yeah, and I think the rest is from the network, if I'm not mistaken. And we will get to know each other. So I pass the word to Tesseltje.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And thank you very much for having us. As a Horizon Europe consortium, GS4S is our title, which is short for a global strategy for skills migration and development. And throughout the day, we will be learning from each other, as well as learning from the guests from outside our consortium. And that is, and we hope, of course, that you also learn from our findings. And that is, of course, the idea of a policy workshop like this, is to get down to the interaction on the topics that we're working on. And global strategy, meaning global. So we have our partner from Nigeria, from Egypt here. Bangladesh partner could unfortunately not get a visa in time. That's always a recurring issue with global projects, be it these kind of workshops or be it in conferences, academic conferences. We always see that people might not be able. So that's maybe something to address when you want to be global and share thoughts about how to do that, to have some visa facility. We look at strategies, we look at policy solutions and more practical tools. And in these 2 days, we will be focusing on those policy solutions, but know that the project, and this can be accessed through the project website, also has online data collected and made available especially trying to understand shortages, because everybody's talking about it, but knowing exactly what is needed where, and that where the talent, people with the proper skills are or ready to be trained, etc. The data is often very difficult to find and access. I won't go into much detail any further, so I'll hand back to Sandra to chair this first session. I really look forward to it. Again, thank you very much to Sandra and Elisa and the team here for hosting this. And we'll have plenty of opportunity to exchange thoughts. So let's go. Thank you. And maybe just Sandra, we have some 30 people who registered to participate online. So also a warm welcome to those who are not in the room, but who are online. And I'm looking over there because somehow I have a feeling the camera is over there and you can see it if I look in that direction. Marcus Anza, good to see you. A Dutch colleague. And Pascal will be taking questions from the online participants, and we ask you to use the chat for that purpose. So once we get to discussing, maybe at some point Pascal will come in with the questions from online. Please feel as welcome as the people in the room to share your thoughts and raise questions that you have. Yeah, thank you.
Just one technical question. Yeah. In the breaks, we should turn off the audio because all the private conversations in this part of the room are all heard by the online participants. So
yeah, but we will cut the preliminary. Before we started talking, this part will be cut because the recordings will be put online afterwards, as I told you. As webinars, so that other people can look at them. And for now, we have a registered group of people who are connected live, and so no surprises in the audience for now for the live version. Oh, hello! Our colleagues from IGC have just arrived. Molly Groom and Angie Larocque. Warm welcome. So I was just saying we have mainly here researchers from our consortium Horizon Europe on global strategy for skills, migration and development. That's the title. Who will share insights from their research and then allow us to interact in person. But we also have the representatives from international organizations and you from the intergovernmental consultations and Mr. Reynolds from SEM, who you may know, I don't know, but probably, yes. That's basically it. Others are academic, I think. So I would like to open the first panel immediately. It will deal with migration and mobility governance from the perspective of international organizations. And we are very honored and really very happy to welcome three key experts on the topic from the international organizations here in Geneva. So I present very briefly in the order of speakers. It will be a bit a different order tonight, but we will start today with Dr. Elizabeth Warren from the International Organization for Migration, the head of the Labor Mobility Movement, Resettlement and Labor Pathway Division. So a broad agenda at the IOM. Then we will have Christiane from the ILO, International Labour Organization, who is senior specialist in migration policy at the ILO. And third, we will hear Antonia Carzaniga, who is counselor in the Trade in Services and Investment Division at the World Trade Organization, and also there especially with so-called Mode 4, which is the technocratic expression for something that little people know about. It's the mobility of natural persons, another slogan in the context of service trade. But this mobility, is linked to economic activity, and it can take also several years in a country if it's a company transfer. So it's a fascinating also side of globalization haven't entered into the governance of migration, and not only nation states holding their discretion here. In the caption, we can say. So we look much forward to hearing your inputs. We asked speakers to, we didn't give any wishes. We just said present from the perspective of your work in your organization, maybe also more on a personal note, but it's up to you, on what your organization is doing, and what are the main challenges and opportunities with regard to this important agenda of skill shortages, which become stronger in Europe and beyond, and what can be done. So I give the floor immediately to Elizabeth. And yeah, we have one presentation on PowerPoint, which will be by Antonia. So we will open it when you speak. We start without. So Elizabeth,
I guess it's good to stand.
Yeah, so it will be better on the picture.
So thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you, Elisa and Professor Delange. First of all, just to say how much of a pleasure it is to be with you all today. Fantastic to be part of an all. So kudos to you for organising in this way, but also to say how much I'm looking forward to the discussion and how important we see this as a topic. Now, as I was thinking about the topic of discussion, I was trying to think about how I could summarise this succinctly, knowing that I had 15 minutes. It came to me in really 6 words: ecosystems, skills optimisation, partnerships, and sustainable development. And I thought, where really to focus the efforts here? As you know, IOM is the International Organization for Migration. We are sister agency of the ILO, partner agency to the WTO. We're also heavily operational, and we work around 3 strategic objectives, one of which is regular pathways. I'm going to anchor my intervention a little bit round from an operational, practical perspective, not so much from a research perspective, but what we're seeing on the ground. Now, when I think about ecosystems in the context of governance, I think we really, from our perspective, very much hone in on the importance of systems building and how skills and skills development, skills recognition, skills mobility can't be seen outside of good, robust international infrastructure. And whether that be in the destination country, but also in the origin country, there's a lot of different elements around this. And I'm flagging this because not that we forget this, but how important it is to situate the discussion in the context of policies, legislation, private sector financing, of which now the financing environment has become very different, but also looking in terms of research planning looking forward. And I think one good example, and here we work with our agency ILO, of how that's done in reality is the Joint Labour Migration Programme. And that's looking at strengthening labour governance on the African continent by looking at not just labour mobility policies at national level, but linking those to the regional and continental infrastructure. So thinking about policies both at the national level, but also at the continental African level. Now, why is that important for a discussion like this? Well, clearly, we're not just talking anymore, or we never really have been talking about skills mobility between country A and country B. We're thinking about what skills mobility looks like in the context of increasing regionalization, free mobility regimes, but also in the context of outward migration north-south or south-south. So clearly migration is changing. Secondly, we do focus a lot in IOM on supporting infrastructure when it comes to bilateral agreements. As does ILO, we complement very much the tripartite examples that they have, but looking at ways in which we can bring in whole of society, whole of government approach, different ministries, different civil society actors, the migrants themselves. And if we think about skills in the context of bilateral schemes, we need to be cognizant of bringing together these different elements together, not just bilateral labour and migration agreements, but also regional frameworks, the ASEAN Mutual Recognition Agreement, for example, that ILO and IOM have been supporting most recently, or the African Union's TVET harmonisation efforts that are ongoing. And again, I raised that because we're no longer talking about a bilateral, or we're talking about a multilateral context in which we're working. I think one element that we are focusing on more and more, not just as IOM, but internally, institutionally, and broadly, is not just thinking about national government actors, but the role that local actors and municipalities play in skills identification, skills building, and recognising pressures of changing demographic environments. And here it will come as no surprise, colleagues from IGC, to mention the example of Norway that we heard speak about this week, who were talking about an important intervention that IOM is working with the Rana municipality, looking at ways in which a country like Norway has traditionally had, in this municipality, a stagnant demographic trajectory, has been trying to attract skills workers working in the sector of battery development, etc. And what they found, and I think this is really interesting because it doesn't strike you as a country where it wouldn't have this in place, but the municipality of Rana mentioned that not only was there not public information about the jobs, the integration context in that municipality, but the migrants themselves were struggling to identify ways in which they could connect to opportunities in the ground, housing, education, health, which goes to the point, again, that everything's interconnected, and that even looking at the skills that you need to fill the labour market in destination, you've got to think about the family, the community in which migrant comes into, but also the community that the migrant is bringing with them, family, etc. And a final point around ecosystem really is at the heart of what migration is all about. And now in a more complicated political environment, the need for trust building. And of course, I don't have to say this to you, but we're looking at public discourse in Europe that's increasingly polarized, globally as well. And for skills to be situated in a politically sustainable ecosystem between the communities that we're engaging with, the migrants that we're working with, and the governments themselves. And I think as one example, IOM is working and supporting something called the Global Migration Governance Academy, the GMMA, which is providing policymakers, practitioners, and political partners information and messaging around good migration governance. That's ecosystems. And again, I'm not saying anything you don't know, it's really to situate this conversation. Then I was thinking about skills optimization. And of course, as IOM, we are very well known about the third part of skills mobilization, which is skills mobility and skills partnerships and working to support skills movement from country A to country B. But I did want to recognize two other elements that are really critical in this discussion, and it comes to maximizing the skills already in the labour market and really thinking about upskilling and reskilling. And again, very much thinking about the context last week of reflecting on integration measures, the need to focus on making much better use of the skills that migrants and refugees already have. We've worked a lot, for example, in the European context to support Ukrainian refugees with temporary protection status, and through the network of migrant resource centres, providing information about language, digital skills training, referral support for job opportunities was a really key part of that. But also we need to take stock of the fact that this labour market inclusion approach is also very necessary for newcomers when it comes to migrants. And one new programme just started implementation is in the Netherlands called the Learn Project, which is working with the Dutch Ministry of Social Affairs and Employment to support employment pathways by combining work and study programmes that help newcomers gain practical experience while upgrading their skills. But also critically, and sometimes this is an area where if you look at it in terms of discourse and complementary measures, it's not just attracting talents to the labour market and bringing them in, it's retaining them. And nurturing talents already in Europe as part of the integration process is really key to that retention process. Not only skilled workers need to be thought about in terms of retention policies, but also probably increasingly skills that in the past may have been already present in the labour market. But taking the examples of retaining talent, IOM supported a project called the Talent Hub, which operated in Denmark and in Germany. And it supported these two EU member states in looking at strategies to attract talent. I think what was interesting from that example is that, again, highly skilled migrants need more than attraction policies. They need information, opportunities about skills development, family and social inclusion, supportive regulatory environments, housing, education, etc. Again, message on skills optimization is link these to broader policy practices. And of course, at the heart of what IOM really promotes is the idea of looking at the future of skills and the role in which migration can play. And it's really not just about fulfilling shortages today and all of the opportunities we're seeing right now. It's building the workforce for the future with pathways that are safe, fair, and globally connected, recognizing that we're operating in a very different political environment than we were even 5 years ago. So perhaps one of the most known about projects within IOM is the TAM Plus project, which is a talent partner program that operates between Italy and Morocco and Tunisia as two origin countries. And where this provides a really interesting example, not only because it's training workers for needs in Morocco and Tunisia, but also for the innovative working directly with the regions. So regions like Emilia-Romagna and others, where the needs are being identified at the regional level, and the policies at national level are connecting much more closely to the regional efforts of these three different regions. And there's a lot to say about that example, but it's certainly one of the ones that's most known about and most closely followed. But there are other initiatives that I think provide really interesting examples, or start to provide really interesting examples as they kick off. Another example is the EAGLE project, which is a planned skills mobility partnership between Austria and Egypt. That project just started this month, but it's looking at ways in which, through IOM support, working with the Austrian authorities, training can be provided to Egyptian workers in welding, metal technology, for the transport and manufacturer sectors, providing language orientation and intercultural preparation for approximately 135 participants, of whom 100 are expected to take up an employment and 35 are expected to take up employment in Egypt. We have yet to see the outcomes of that project as it's just started, but it will highlight several different examples of how you can harness skills not just for the benefit of the destination country, but also work in the needs of the countries of origin as well. But also we need to think longer term about bridging those international pipelines together. Transition depends on building future-ready skills abroad. And one example of how we're doing that is in Vietnam, where we're supporting national efforts to embed green and digital skills within vocational educational and training systems in line with the country's transition towards sustainable and resilient economy. And these efforts will ensure that the students in the program will acquire skills aligned with what is an evolving labour market and a global need in future. So I'm mindful of the time, but just to really close up by saying, ecosystems, absolutely, we need to look at them. We need to think about skills in terms of all of the different ways that skills interact with ability. But of course, other elements are equally important, whether it be partnerships or those deeper embedding within development programming. So I really look forward to today's discussion and very happy to provide further details on any of the examples I've shared. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It really spoke to many of the aspects that the members of our network are working about. So I'm sure we will have lots of questions, also case studies, you know, in countries where we have expertise in the room. So maybe we can go directly to ILO, and we will take the discussion then in a grouped way. So Christiane, who has been following what ILO is doing for
too many years. So no, I don't want to say the many years I've been there. But I'm very happy to be here with you. Some familiar faces, some not so familiar faces, and exactly as Elizabeth, I'm looking very much forward to learning with you on some of the things that we also work on in the ILO. As an introduction, let me say, as Liz has also done, a few words about what characterizes the ILO's migration-related work. The ILO focuses on labor markets as a whole, seeing migration as an integral part of those markets. And we focus on migrants as workers. And that is very important in all of our work, where we're saying by our trade unions, a worker is a worker is a worker. And thanks to the ILO's decent work agenda, which has 4 pillars: fundamental principles and rights at work, employment, social protection, and social dialogue, we can bridge the economic and social dimensions of migration. Our aim is to ensure well-functioning labor markets while protecting labor rights and fostering cohesion. Importantly, the ILO has worked to embed migration policies in wider employment, economic, and social policies, and it advocates a level playing field for national and non-national workers, but also for businesses, those who have access to migrants and those who don't. We consider that lower standards for migrant workers undermine economic performance and social cohesion. Our work on skills and skills mobility has to be seen against the backdrop of this holistic approach, and that's the title of my intervention. Actually, when I saw that your project here is a project to create a global strategy to address skills shortages in particular sectors, including migration policies and alternatives to migration, I thought, wow, this could be an ILO project. This would be very much our approach to such a topic. Addressing skills shortages requires work at different levels. There is the anticipation and forecasting of skills, as well as skills development, recognition, and matching. And ideally, in all of these areas, there is coherence between national employment, education, training policies, and migration policies as well. Let me start with the anticipation and forecasting part. As indicated by the ILO Human Resource Development Recommendation from 2004, and those who are interested in numbers, it's 195, anticipation and forecasting of skills are crucial elements for identifying, measuring, and forecasting market trends in the supply of and demand for competencies and qualifications. To assess skill shortages and imbalances, skills anticipation may use different methods that summarize labor market information. Forecasting, and you know about some of these things and the difficulties, usually reports on quantitative methods, resorts to quantitative methods, such as macroeconomic modeling. Data-intensive skills anticipation methods are mostly used in high-income countries, since their implementation needs considerable financial and human resources. Whereas in low and medium-income countries, a possible approach is the use of qualitative methods, and also then with the involvement of the social partners. As a general sideline, at the ILO, we are convinced that the tripartite approach to policymaking, that is the participation of employers and workers' organizations besides government representatives, is important for bringing both legitimacy and effectiveness to social and economic policies, including also to migration policies. As actors of the real economy, employers and workers know how to improve the labor market relevance of policies, as well as individual measures. Now, skills anticipation can serve different purposes, such as the updating of the national education and training system, or the creation of national economic development plans. Mostly, skills anticipation efforts are only applied nationally. They are rarely extended to meeting future demands for migrant labor. However, it would be very important in our view to incorporate the results of skills anticipation exercises into the design of labor migration policies. And this is a challenge that applies to both destination and origin countries, and Liz already alluded to this. And one should not forget that where anticipation efforts are originally driven by labor migration needs, this can also happen, they can also contribute to then enhancing education and training policies at the more systematic level, that is to benefit all participants in the labor market. So we have this double relation in terms of what comes first, the national or the labor migration policy. And this is why it's so important to have this holistic approach to skills anticipation. I would like to give you the example of Italy here. In Italy, a regular survey is carried out monthly by the Excelsior system through a detailed compulsory questionnaire aimed at collecting information on occupational needs, recruitment channels, and hard-to-fill vacancies. The survey is not specifically targeted at migrant workers, but it does include a question on migrant labor, and this goes like this approximately. Has your company already decided, or does it plan to hire immigrant personnel for this position? And then a survey is based upon the computer-assisted web interviewing methodology and allows for an estimation of labor demand for the following quarter. And the results of this continuous survey also allow for the determination of yearly estimates. In general, my colleagues tell me who have assessed this, the system works well because it is based on mandatory information provided by enterprises registered in the Chamber of Commerce. And concerning labor migration, however, a key limitation of the survey is that it does not cover agriculture and the care economy, while these are two sectors in Italy which are highly migrant worker dominated. And another caveat, as with all such surveys, the quality and relevance of companies' responses are not always consistent. You can't really help that, as you all know as researchers. There are also risks of inequality, of not well addressing labor market demands at all skill levels, leading to an increased precarity in the labor market. As you know, there is this trend in many countries now to prefer or only to allow highly skilled migrants. But if there is an unrecognized demand for low and medium skilled jobs, these then often end up by being filled with short-term national contract workers and agency workers, or with migrant workers in irregular situations. And the growing concentration of migrant workers in certain economic sectors, such as agriculture, construction, and care, might actually be an indication of structural skills shortages, and that jobs in these areas may not be as temporary as they might seem. But let me now move to the skills development, recognition, and matching aspects. From the ILO's perspective, education and training systems should be based on lifelong learning principles to respond to constantly evolving labor market demands. In practice, this means that individuals of all ages, including also migrant workers, should have equal access to quality learning to maintain their employability throughout their life. Needless to say that this again requires adequate policies and institutions, as well as human and financial resources. Skills development and matching are important for the career path of national and migrant workers alike, and important for increased productivity and job satisfaction. Similarly, the validation of prior learning concerns all work. But prior learning, by prior learning, I mean non-formal learning, for example, in context of informal employment, where no certificates are delivered with qualifications that are required on the job, yet workers do enhance their skills in this context. In addition, now for migrant workers, the recognition of their foreign qualifications often becomes critical for their labor market integration and destination. But here too, one has to take a holistic approach and consider the linkages with the education and training systems and the cost implications of recognition processes as well. And let me give you an example here. Germany has adopted a law on the assessment of equivalence of vocational qualifications. Berufsqualifikationsfeststellungsgesetz, one of the best words in German Scrabble. The purpose of this Recognition Act, as it is called for short, is a better use in the German labor market of qualifications acquired abroad to obtain the nearest possible match of qualifications and employment. This act went into force in April 2012, and not too long after, I went to Berlin to interview stakeholders, for example, in chambers of industry and commerce and in chambers of crafts, to find out how this is implemented in practice. I learned that recognition procedures focus on job content as opposed to job title, and that one difficulty in this context is to determine which German job in comparison, with which German job the comparison is to be made. The experts on and practitioners of recognition who I met noted that access to the labor market is easiest and barriers to occupational mobility are lowest in jobs which are organized in the migrants' countries of origin in similar ways as in Germany. And this is often the case in core crafts around food production, bakers, butchers, etc., as well as in facility management and construction, for example. It is noteworthy that in German recognition processes, professional experience and further education are taken into account, and that all of the recognition procedures are highly individualized, no matter which institutions carry them out. But I also learned that these processes are quite costly. If I recall correctly, in the crafts, a cost of 2,000 euros per recognition, not borne by the migrants, but by the employers, were not uncommon. So try to convince an employer to go through the procedure. But they want the workers, so they might. Huh? Well, back to some more general considerations. Interestingly, in some contexts, it is migration policy that drives the upgrade of national education and training systems. For example, in some origin countries, continuous and adult training may not have been sufficiently developed for lack of a conceptual framework, for lack of sufficient social partner engagement or resources simply. But then it starts taking off following the conclusion of a bilateral labor migration agreement, and in turn enables skills harmonization and skills portability along migrated corridors. And we have heard about some of these examples from Liz, so I will not go into this again. So, but let me say a few words about some other policies and institutional setups which can help with addressing skills shortages. Many countries have developed or are in the process of establishing national qualification frameworks. These are mechanisms to link education and training to labor market needs. A national qualifications framework is a system that classifies education and professional qualifications into levels based on learning outcomes, making qualifications easier to understand, compare, and also gain recognition both nationally and internationally. National qualification frameworks can help individuals see pathways for lifelong learning and contribute to the international recognition of qualifications by linking those frameworks to more regional ones like the European qualification framework, for example. Currently, there are more than 140 national qualification frameworks globally at one stage or another of design and implementation. And this last is the caveat, because it should be noted that the creation of a national qualification frameworks may be a very lengthy and costly process. And a short to medium-term solution, perhaps even a stepping stone for developing a fully fledged framework, can be the creation of sector-based occupational requirement committees or councils. The role of such sector skill bodies is usually to improve the labor market relevance of training by contributing to the analysis of skills needs and to the development of occupational standards. Of course, here again, the soundness of the work of these committees depends on the companies involved, the level of government support, and the effective engagement of employers and workers' organizations. Not easy. And my final point. In a holistic perspective on skills mobility within and across borders and on addressing skills shortages, one has to not only look at how to attract workers from abroad, but also at how to activate the local labor force and how to retain skilled workers. In all areas, non-discrimination, equality, and fair labor market outcomes are crucial. And these are also basic ILO values and objectives. Discrimination and even violence against workers who are different from the majority of staff in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, or other characteristics occur in many cases, as we all know. Stereotypes and biases, sometimes unconscious biases, prevent workers who are not considered the typical worker in a given environment or who are otherwise in a minority position from fully participating in the labor market on an equal footing with those who are considered the normality. At the same time, stereotypes and biases leading to discrimination and violence, whether in blatant or subtle forms, also hinder the creation of more diverse workforces, because minority workers are then discouraged and leave the places where they are abused, often with scaring effects for their future careers, and inequalities are thus perpetuated. Discrimination because of otherness does happen to migrant workers, but it also happens to local workers. For example, when they are women working in an occupation or sector dominated by men. And because the GS4S project is interested in the construction sector, among others, I would like to cite some findings from a chapter of an ILO book on diversity in this context. Research by Laurence Amel-Roy and Elise Dumont-Lagacé has examined the impact of discrimination and violence on women's ability to remain employed in Quebec's construction industry, where there are already very few women. Laurence and Elise wondered why a far larger share of women leaves the sector, 56% as compared to 35% of men after 5 years, and why they leave often for good. And explanations include the following: a construction site culture that values competition, pride, and physical strength, an environment of intimidation where the basic rights of women workers are not respected, employers who openly distrust women's skills in the trade and convey the message that women at the worksite may mean trouble, and a high visibility owing to the low numbers of women workers. These problems are amplified by the organization of work in the industry, where short-term contracts are frequent and linked to individual construction sites, with high competition among the workers for sites offering more stable employment. The women very often don't get those contracts. Amel-Roy and Dumont-Lagacé also discussed the hyper-visibility-invisibility paradox, as they call it, where policy interventions intended to make women in the industry visible so as to attract more of them to this line of work may backfire by giving the impression that women enjoy advantages that they don't really exist in practice. So my final message is basically, if you want to address labor shortages by either attracting foreign workers or by activating local labor, get away with discrimination and combat stereotypes and biases. In a climate of inequality and unfairness, it will be very difficult even to retain you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this. It was very much in the continuity of Elizabeth's talk, but yet bringing new aspects of it. I'm really happy about the maybe systematic systems view, holistic approach, global approach is our label, comes together, and yet comes another bit of the puzzle with the trade policy perspective that we will hear from Antonia. I just open the slides. I can see them there.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to provide a perspective that's going to be a bit different in the sense that I'm coming at it from a trade perspective, as well as from a much sort of more high-level perspective and less on the ground, direct, relevant experience. First, I need to say that what I'm about to say does not represent the views or opinions of the WTO or its members. And so, disclaimer out of the way, I cannot have that station. So this is, I managed to decide this is what I intend to talk to you about. And I'll try to make the link to skills whenever I can. But as you will see, I will present a framework for how mobility, or a very particular sort of confined part of mobility, is governed at the multilateral level. And then I will also say a few words about what is happening regionally, although we have further, much deeper information that's coming to me from Sandra, but I'm just going to give you a perspective. So I will talk about what we in the WTO call that's the movement of natural persons to supply services. I'll give you a sense of what the disciplines that exist at the multilateral level are. And then, as I said, I'm going to take a look at what is happening at the regional level, very broad overview. So starting with why does a trade organization like the WTO address a mobility-related dimension? And this is just because it's, as you know, the title of the presentation that was suggested by Sandra, which I found very, very well chosen, is because it's mobility to trade. So we're not looking at the mobility, international mobility in and by itself, but more as a means to an end. And that end is to trade services. Because of the characteristics of services that tend to be intangible, you often need the simultaneous presence of the supplier and the consumer in order for a service to be traded or to be provided. And therefore, one way to do so internationally is through the movement of individuals, of the service suppliers or employees of the service suppliers across border. So what the rules of the WTO do is that they set, as I said, a framework about services that are traded, supplied through the presence of natural persons of one member in the territory of another WTO member. And we have two types of natural persons that we look at under this framework, for which we have disciplines. One is a self-employed individual, so someone who is working as an independent service supplier. And the second type of movement that is covered by the WTO rules is in the case of an employee of a service supplier. And the scope of Mode 4 is very narrow in terms of what the WTO rules apply to, because we're really only looking first at the services economy, and then we're looking at, when we're talking about employees that are hired by foreign service suppliers in the country of destination, as you would call it. And then we have a number of exceptions to what our rules do not cover. So we do not cover job seekers, so we don't have a specific definition of what that is, but I think the understanding is that individuals cannot just show up at the border and say, I would like to supply services as a service supplier, but there has to be a pre-existing contract, either to supply a service independently or an employment contract with a foreign service supplier. And then we do not cover measures that apply to citizenship, residence, and employment on a permanent basis. So, a contrario, we say that Mode 4 is a temporary presence of foreign individuals in a market for the purpose, in a foreign market for the purpose of supplying a service. And then we have a big caveat in our rules is that governments remain free to regulate entry and temporary stay of foreign service suppliers in their market, of course, including by applying differential visa requirements. So that's a big caveat, if you want, to an overarching obligation which we have in the WTO system, which is to give identical treatment to all our members. But given the way immigration systems are set up worldwide, it was recognized that we had to allow for the fact that differential visa requirements apply depending on the nationality of the service supplier. So this is really just a broad overview of the type of mobility that we cover. So very much intended to provide a service. And so what happens, if you want, if you will, when this type of movement is covered by WTO discipline? Well, what the WTO system provides is a certain degree of guarantees for mobility intended to supply services. So each WTO member has included a number of legally binding commitments to allow foreign suppliers, foreign individuals to come and supply services domestically. We call these specific commitments because they're specific to each of the WTO members. Each one has a certain amount of access that it has granted to individuals who are intended to supply services. These commitments indicate how much access is granted And generally, this is organized by type of movements. So you will find, for instance, commitments for intra-corporate transferees much more frequently than commitments for self-employed individuals. And then they set out if any discriminatory measures members want to continue, our member governments want to continue to apply. These commitments are legally binding obligations, and they provide for minimum access that is guaranteed to foreign individuals. Of course, in practice, the regimes that are applicable may be much more liberal, but they are less certain because they're not guaranteed in the specific commitments. And then an important, almost by definition, construct of the WTO system is that these commitments apply equally to all WTO members. So when one member government provides access for nationals to supply services either as employee or as self-employed individual, it has to grant that access to all other WTO members, nationals to all other WTO members. That's what we call the most favored obligation, a little bit confusing because it means you're not favoring anyone actually. So you're giving the best treatment and you're extending it to everybody else. And then of course there's another number of other obligations such as publication of measures, notifications of changes of rules. Why is it all of this relevant? In a sense, it provides guarantees for mobility for foreign individuals who wish to provide services. And in that way, it provides guarantees that certain level of skills will be given guaranteed levels of access. And any changes to the rules that are applicable will also need to be notified and to shared and to be published. So what do these commitments look like? I'm giving you an overview. What has been guaranteed in the WTO framework? The first thing we see is that there are no full access guaranteed by almost any WTO member. So access is generally given to certain categories of individuals in certain sectors. Those sectors, those conditions of access tend to be sort of horizontally very similar. So as I said, there are guarantees in certain sectors, but there are identical guarantees across all these particular sectors. So we notice there's very little sectoral diversification. In a sense, what WTO governments did when they undertook this commitment is to actually look at the categories of temporary foreign workers that they allowed in their jurisdictions and decided to undertake commitments for those. So generally these are individuals like business visitors, people who come to attend meetings, or intra-corporate transferees, people who are transferred from maybe the headquarters to a subsidiary abroad. And there's very little sectoral differentiation, at least for now. Although there was an attempt to allow, for instance, greater access for certain professions where skills were obviously more of a concern. But so far, this hasn't happened. You must understand that these commitments date back to 30 years ago. And apart from new countries or new economies that have become WTO members, they have not really been updated since. Then what we see is that, as I already alluded to, although our rules cover in principle self-employed individuals as well as employees, people who are employed by service supplier, by services firms, in practice, access is really granted a lot more frequently for the employees. A self-employed service supplier is very infrequently granted legally binding access in the commitments that WTO members have taken. There is, I guess you know this better than I do, but in the sort of migration community, there is a saying there is nothing more permanent than a temporary migrant, and someone who is not affiliated with a domestic company in the country of destination is maybe perceived as being at greater risk of overstaying. And then this links in a sense to, again, to the discussion of skills. What we find is that these commitments provide guaranteed access conditions for individuals who generally have high levels of education, high levels of training. These are graduates, even postgraduates individuals. However, although this is what is in our schedules, that's not the construct. I mean, our rules in principle do not differentiate based on the level of, it's just that what individual member governments of the WTO have chosen to do is to only guarantee access for the highest trained and the highest qualified individuals. And then, as I said, mode 4 is sort of the temporary presence of these individuals to supply foreigners to supply services, and how long they're allowed to stay, how long is temporary, is up to each WTO member government to determine. So it really depends. When it comes to intra-corporate transferees, you may find duration of stay allowed for 3 to 5 years. When it comes to, for instance, business visitors or independent professionals, we're looking more at stays of periods of 3 months. And then what we also observe is that although these specific categories of individuals are allowed entry, these entries not necessarily unconstrained. So there are some quotas, so limit on the total number of certain individuals who are allowed to move, or frequently they're linked to what is known as labor market tests, which again links up to the discussion of skills. There is an assessment first, do we have the necessary skills domestically? And if we don't, then entry is conditioned upon that finding. There are also sometimes requirements that individuals be residents for the duration of their stay in the country. So, for example, this may be an issue for independent professionals who may not want to require residency if they're staying for a few weeks only. And then sometimes we have sort of unspecified authorization and approval requirements that we are not sure what kind of, on what basis these authorizations or approvals are granted. So this sort of gives you very broadly a sense of what has been guaranteed at the multilateral level and vis-a-vis, all WTO members, so on an MFN base. Then I just wanted to say very few words about what is happening also in trade agreement, but at the regional level. And here I think I'm pointing and I'm speaking about this because, as I said, the WTO rules and commitments are largely 30 years old, and there hasn't been really a successful trade negotiation since. And so we have very limited advances or very limited progress in what was given 30 years ago. But we've seen that in the meantime, of course, a lot of action has taken place in the context of regional trade agreement. And in particular, what we see is that, well, this is information that's 2 or 3 years old, but these regional trade agreements have to be notified. And so members need to inform the WTO that they've concluded these agreements. And we have over 180, there are probably more now, that have been notified, of which about 100 cover specific disciplines with regard to Mode 4. So they provide for greater access, so they provide for some additional categories, sometimes for longer durations of stay, but they also set up some additional obligations, which are intended to facilitate that access and, in a sense, help with the entire discussion about addressing these shortages. So, as I said, in terms of granting additional access, these regional trade agreements do provide for some better openness, but these advances are not that spectacular. Yes, we have additional categories for business visitors, but for example, in the categories that a lot of developing countries are particularly interested in the WTO context, which is independent professionals, because you don't necessarily need to work for multinationals in order to provide services, we've seen very, very limited progress. Although it is also fair to say that in trade agreements, usually they cover many more services sectors than in the WTO. context. Therefore, this access is also expanded to go beyond the sectors that you find on the WTO at the multilateral level. And that often, although under the WTO, this mobility is exclusively for services sectors, because it's a means to an end, as I said, to trade services. In regional trade agreements, this mobility has often been guaranteed for sectors that are also, for instance, manufacturing or agricultural sectors. So they go beyond just the services sectors, although services account for about 70% of GDP on average. So covering services sector is covering 70% of the world economy. And so what do we find? And these are the last few slides or information that I want to leave with you. What do we find that where regional trade agreements have made progress, which could provide, in a way, if you will, some kind of sandbox for further action to be taken multilaterally? What we see is that they provide for additional obligation, additional rules, especially on 3 areas. One is transparency. The second is with regard to fees for instance, visas or work permits fees, and then in terms of application procedures. So essentially, if you will, they build on the access that is already granted by trying to facilitate that access, either by making the conditions more transparent, or the fees more cost-based, or the procedures more predictable for applicants. So for example, when it comes to transparency, these agreements provide that the information, the procedures that are relevant, the forms that are needed, the material for accessing a foreign country be made publicly available or be published. This is all in the interest of ensuring that, you know, advantage can be taken of the access that has been given. And then another area where they've made progress by creating additional obligations that we do not have at the multilateral level is that, for example, when fees, I said visa fees or work permit fees, these be reasonable or be not set in a way that makes them unjustified impediments to access and therefore to trade, or be based on costs. So they're trying to ensure that these fees are not in effect used as a way to undermine the access and therefore impair or delay trade. And finally, they also added disciplines when it comes to the procedures where you apply for entry, for example. So for example, if you're applying for a work permit or for a visa, then you should be, as an applicant, be informed of the outcome. Because not being informed sort of creates uncertainty, or be informed about where your application is in the process of being approved. And then, in addition, some of the provisions require that, for example, when you have submitted a complete application, that these be processed in an expeditious manner. You can imagine at the back of the mind of the negotiators are all the measures that they see, that they experience, that in practice, although access has been granted, can actually undermine that particular access. So overall, this is what we see emerge at the regional level, beyond the additional access that is also a feature of regional trade agreements, and that, you know, provide inspiration for additional such disciplines at the multilateral level. And I think with this, I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for this quite illustrative talk about something that is quite technical in these legal texts, either multilateral treaties or bilateral and regional trade agreements. I think we have seen how in this international cooperation, there is quite a bit either project-based, right, that is developing, which is more what in the IOM you are working with, or in the ILO you try to maybe set a bit more standards as well with the decent work agenda, the non-discrimination agenda. And of course, the WTO has been very much focused on rule setting in the past. And this is maybe the most difficult part of multilateralism at the moment, to make progress on rules, but at the level of projects, of more practical cooperation, and also these questions of mutual recognition of, or let's say recognition of qualifications, procedures, and also what you were saying about the implementation of PTA commitments at the level of the fees, of the duration of a procedure, and so on. I mean, this is maybe something that works better in present times in cooperation. So I don't want to abuse the chair, so I collect questions and comments to our wonderful speakers. And Pascal is looking at the chat as well.
You need to move this a little bit, because otherwise people don't see your faces. And maybe I can move this a little bit to this side.
Yes, our camera is sort of fixed. You cannot much. You see the cables.
A little bit, right? Maybe we'll try it for the next session.
Try it in the break.
Improving that much.
Maybe if you took your computer and put the camera on it, I can do it, but I don't know. Yeah. So let's start anyways. I mean, people can hear us and ask the questions in the chat in the meantime. So Jessica, yeah, and I will collect a few comments. Yeah.
Thank you. Really very rich presentations, and yeah, super informative and insightful. Thank you very much. I'm Jessica Carzaniga, and I'm head of the Migration and Displacement Hub at ODI Global. I had a question to Christiane, sorry, on the Italian Excelsior system, which I thought was really super interesting. So you said the monthly surveys basically gave an overview of labor demand across different sectors except for care and agriculture. And I was wondering what's then done with that data. Are, for example, visa quotas adjusted on the basis of that data? Is migration policy then basically linked to that labor migration system, which is also what you were arguing for? So yeah, I was wondering a bit more about how that works. And Antonia, I also have a question to you about the self-employed category of Mode 4, because you explained that it can't be, Mode 4 can't be used to basically come to a country and then look for a job. But I was just wondering how that works with self-employed people. Do they already have to be in the country? Yeah, thank you.
Yes, I should
follow up on Jessica's question about the survey in Italy, which I also was drawn to. Is there an intention to replicate that survey somewhere else in Europe or outside of it? And what was your finding on that intriguing question on whether the companies are intending to recruit migrants? Thank you. And I'm Jessica Helmat. I work as a professor at Rabat University.
Someone else? Yes.
Hello, I'm Zina Abdelfattah. I'm from the American University of Cairo, so I'm bringing voices of the Global South to this discussion. I'll actually start with a comment that Sandra made, which is multilateralism and how we're seeing the agenda, the global agenda now going, with funding priorities changing, and many of the projects being implemented are mostly project-based, operating in silos to some extent. So I just wanted to hear from your side, because we usually have these discussions on a local level. So with the IOM/ILO representatives in the Cairo offices, how are we seeing the sustainability of these programs or these initiatives? So the funding agenda changes. We saw that the US aid or the US president has withdrawn funding from some projects from the ILO, for example. So seeing this, how can we ensure that at the end of the day, the objective is met? So we have small projects, pilots. How are we assessing their success or identifying their challenges or gaps so we can scale them up and say, okay, we've achieved an objective with these projects. This is always a question I have in mind. For Antonia, this is again a topic that we usually discuss for the inter-African trade relationships or agreements, and we know that mobility is part of the trade agreements in Africa. However, it's always a dormant side of the agreement, and we're seeing the challenges usually on the limited mobility or the free mobility, like the visa issuance. There's no free mobility between different African countries. So we understand how it's actually being perceived in Europe, but not as much how it's actually implemented on the African side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think we will address these large questions first. Yeah, feel free to. Christiane, you look like you are ready.
I don't know, but as ready as one can be. So are visa quotas adjusted, and is migration policy actually linked to this data in Italy? We would hope so, and we certainly in the ILO plead with the government to do these things. But you know how migration policy is very politicized these days, and sometimes, and that's the biggest challenge in this whole area, that labor migration policy has sometimes nothing to do with the labor market. So this is my unfortunately crass answer, which has also to do with what's happening in the multilateral system. And yeah, on your question, to replicate this, yeah, we also again hope that other countries would replicate such approaches and certainly give examples of others. We were also having, I think, at the level of Costa Rica, they are replicating these kinds of things. But you know, with these political caveats that yeah, the labor market is not always the dominant consideration for governments these days. On the multilateral system, and how does the current developments, how do the current developments have implications, and how do we try to sort of make systems sustainable? I think from an ILO perspective, all of our projects are really trying to make projects sustainable by capacity building exercises, which we build into these projects, and also by involving the social partners, because these people are on the spot. And the big hope is there that they will actually take responsibility because they have liked what they have seen, and will actually take responsibility to carry this forward, even lacking resources. And we are also always trying to, of course, find second phases for projects, etc. Together with IOM, very often we are engaging in those kinds of processes. But very much sort of in all of ILO's projects, one big aspect is the sustainable issue, because whether you have financial cuts or not, this has always been a problem in the multilateral system when it comes to sort of short-term projects, or yeah, even longer-term projects. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Elizabeth.
So maybe to complement what Christiane was talking about in terms of the funding side, I think this is really a critical issue. An organization like IOM, where we're 93% projectized, obviously we're very much funded by programming. I'm very grateful to the donors that we have and continue to support us. There is a knock-on effect. And so shrinking funding obviously has implications, particularly in the development space, for ongoing and future activities. And, you know, a project might be funded by multiple donors. And so if one pulls out, then there's implications for the programming and the financing cycle going forward. But like ILO mentioned, we do focus a lot within programming, and because we have distinct projects with durations, with end dates, the outcomes, outputs are going to be monitored and evaluated at the end of the project, and there's always a focus on capacity development and some form of exit strategy at the end so that local partners can take over. But I would say one really important thing, and here I'm looking at our colleague from SEM, is I think there's a need most certainly for different types of innovative funding, financing. And so recognizing that the grant space is shrinking and that government's capacity to provide funding in this space is reducing, there needs to be new and innovative ways of bringing in the private sector, of bringing in philanthropy, for considering different ways of financing interventions, not only focusing on the traditional destination countries for migration, but bringing in origin countries. The World Bank has done some interesting modeling around the benefits that migration brings, arguing that in fact there are benefits for origin countries, and so more funding needs to be directed into origin system functioning. From the IOM perspective, probably that will not go far enough. We need to be looking at all these different forms of financing and what they mean to continue to enable those countries for whom system strengthening is required over the longer term.
Maybe just a two-finger on this one before we come to Antonia. These projects that you were also addressing in your talk, Denmark, Germany, Morocco, Austria, Egypt, the initiative comes from the states, right? They design a program, and then different implementing agencies can apply for the or do you develop the initiative conjointly with the governments? So I think this would be interesting to know. Is it because we know, for example, the European Union often designs big programs and then it looks for other organizations to implement, but how does it work with governments? Are you more connected to them in the process of designing these programs? Because then, yeah, we could see better how something bigger, more systematic can build up. And I think
this is a nice connection to what you're raising as well as an online question from Benjamin Minard. Would you consider highly regulated visa outsourcing companies as reliable partners to facilitate labor migration at scale, especially when it comes to skills or document verification in origin countries and third country nationals' official information campaigns?
Can you repeat that one?
The question here is the visa outsourcing, collaborating with companies. Are they considered as reliable partners to facilitate labor migration at scale, especially when it comes to skills and document verification in origin countries?
Yeah.
Skipping the final part because we can add on.
How do you want to?
Yeah, you can start. Yes, sure. Or do you have also a point on this, Antonia?
On this particular question, no.
No. So we will come back to the other questions.
So there
On the
was
funding.
two questions. There was one on funding and then was one on visa providers. I think on the funding side, it depends. It really depends on the modality. So there are frequently calls for proposals from different governments for a specific area, specific priority. The Commission, the European Commission, has many processes like this. There's often ongoing work in the background with governments over many, many years to engage on different areas of intervention. So relationships are built, priorities are given for multi-annual programming. Some of the ones I mentioned in my presentation were a result of that kind of engagement. And then you'll see, obviously, there's more ad hoc funding, increased emphasis, at least within our organization, at working with the private sector. So programming with different private sector entities, whether they be employers or large multinational companies, and then funding from other sources, philanthropic, different providers like that. So it really depends on what the fundraising aspect is about. But on the second question around highly regulated visa service providers, it is an area that IOM works with visa providers. I think we need to be careful to think about the role that these outsourced players provide, and it is often to literally verify the documents provided for the visa application. So it's only one step in the migration cycle. It doesn't provide access to the labour market. It doesn't provide information beyond that specific component of the visa process. And of course, not all countries have outsourced their visa processes to a third company or a third process provider, or have done so for all types of visas. So it's a specific area of migration management.
Yes, I can only subscribe to what Liz has just said about the project development. Definitely, in the ILO, we are not developing any projects and then say to government, hey, you should do this. Never. It's always a question of sort of a government coming to us, wishing to work on a certain problem that they have. And sometimes this is also linked from the side of the government, because they have seen that there are funds available, for instance, in EU pots, sort of, that they say, could we do something with you on those particular issues? So there is a little bit of also a donor-driven, to some extent, agenda, if you like, but it's donor-driven, not from our side, but then also because there is those pots, the governments come to us and really, yeah. And my colleagues who are working on development cooperation projects very much engage with not only governments, but then also the social partners from the start. It's sort of, it's a question whether this is also acceptable by the employers' organizations and the workers' organizations in the country. So that is also some process which makes our entire existence and working always very slow. But on the other hand, then you usually have a lot of buy-in and also the prospect of this being more sustainable. Yep, and on the sort of the highly regulated visa outsourcing companies, are they reliable partners? I guess this is to some extent a question of regulation then as well, a question that is in the area of recruitment and recruitment policies. And there you may all know that the ILO has developed critical guidance on giving clear instructions sort of to different stakeholders in the recruitment projects and process, and how this should be regulated.
Thank you. Yes, maybe we take Antonia's response. There was also one very specific about the independent professionals.
Thank you very much for the question. So although we don't have particular guidance of what that doesn't cover, individuals seeking to access the labor market means, what I call job seekers. I think one way of looking at it is that a self-employed individual would come pursuant to a contract that they have obtained with someone in the receiving country. So if you are, I don't know, a chef, and you've been contracted by a local restaurant to provide your service, then you wouldn't necessarily come in and look for a job or for an employment opportunity, but you already have a pre-existing contract pursuant to which you are actually asking for access. So that's kind of the difference. You're not just showing up at the border and saying, well, let me see if I find a job as a chef, or if I find, you know, a contract to provide my cooking services, but you'll be doing that based on a pre-existing contract. So that's the way sort of we look at this. And then on the second question, I think it was a very valid point, in the sense that, for example, when I said what's going on at the regional level, you know, one comment that was often made is that, oh, you know, the commitments at the multilateral level are not very deep in terms of who has been guaranteed access. Maybe this is because it's easier to provide deeper access at the regional level. Well, at least looking at regional trade agreements, it's marginally easier, but it's not that much easier. And I think, you know, when it comes, for example, to visa policies, I think there are a number of indicators that a number of immigration firms put out in terms of who needs a visa to go where. And especially in Africa, what you find is that generally nationals of developed countries will have a much easier time in getting access to many African countries than fellow African nationals. So there is certainly an issue with how, you know, generally sensitive this issue is, and therefore even at the regional level, we do not see a lot of progress when it comes to allowing greater access. What we see is kind of trying to make sure that whatever access is granted is facilitated. Thank you.
Good. Yes, we have tested here.
And online, I suppose.
So online is a rather general question to ILO. In the presentation from IOM, a lot of concrete examples have been presented. Could you provide some concrete examples also for ILO initiatives? Give the online participants a bit more of an idea of what we're referring to.
Yeah, and we collect a few tested here, and then Xenia.
Yes, thank
Daniel.
you. Thank you very much to all three of you for these presentations. I'm gonna be the lawyer in the room. There's of course the WTO that's mode 4, that's clearly, we're talking trade law, and the regional. Actually, a colleague, Diego Acosta, is mapping all the regional trade agreements, and there's a huge, and mobility agreements, I'm saying, a huge increase on paper, not necessarily on the ground. So we have GATS and mode 4. Then, of course, Christine, you're the ILO conventions. There's so many of them, and they are so important for workers as well as specifically migrant workers. And we see that these are actually sometimes part of trade agreements. I see that the EU, and I'm really curious how you look at that the EU actually makes reference to ILO conventions in trade agreements with the rest of the world, demanding that those countries ratify these ILO conventions that the member states have not ratified. So there's a little of a moral double standard there. So I'm really curious. And then there's the GCM, the Global Compact on Migration, and which is soft law, yes, but it is based on hard law, on international treaties on, for instance, non-discrimination, equal treatment, etc. So I see it as hard law in that you can't use it in court, but the norms and values that are written down there are, and there's a lot of countries working on implementing it. Not so much inside the EU, but outside, I know that there's a lot of work being done and it's taken serious. So bringing these three international legal frameworks together in one workshop is already a big joy. But may I invite you to see how we might be able to use those international frameworks to do one thing that you put forward, which is if we want to attract talent and you want to retain talent, you need to treat them nicely, just putting it very simple, which discrimination is not. Can we put something in these trade agreements that backfires on the EU to say you have to treat people properly if you want to be part of this? Why are we preaching? So that's just an example of where it might be, but you surely know better where we might put this. Thanks.
Question? You have a lot to think about. So we collect, and maybe this will be an easier question. Xenia.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Xenia. I'm part of the Radboud University team for GS4S, and yeah, I'm very happy to be here. I think it's a rare opportunity to have all this expertise together. So our colleagues from Bangladesh are not here, but I was wondering, also in line with the question on ILO work and examples to the holistic approach to skills mobility. So last year there was an announcement of the talent partnership with Bangladesh that is implemented by the ILO and the Bangladeshi government, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm curious to know what have been experiences so far with the program. I could not find evaluations yet, assuming it's early. And my very specific question is, at least listening to the presentations of the talent partnership a year ago, I had an impression that it was very much geared towards needs of the EU member states, so the destination countries. And I wonder what happens with then the needs of the Bangladeshi labor market, assuming that jobs are not organized equally and do not require the same set of competencies in the EU and in Bangladesh.
Yes, thank you. And we will take Daniel.
Yeah, so.
Okay, and one more, but
Okay.
first you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm Daniel Speldekamp. I work at University of Groningen. Incredibly interesting talk, so thank you very much. I think I have a question that touches both on what Tesseltje and Ksenia said, so in that way they come together quite nicely. We've been talking a lot about equal treatment and social cohesion, especially Christiane. Thank you for that. My question then is quite simple. Does the holistic approach to the issues of skill mobility also include the actual economic effects in the country of origin? So is that something that is considered? Of course, there's issues of brain drain, well, displacement of workers. So in terms of the remit of the ILO, perhaps, and perhaps your own expertise, is this something that you look at? What the effects are on the country of origin? I'm just wondering how this fits into the 4 pillars, because those mostly seem to be connected to the needs of the receiving countries. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and then we take a last question from the audience online, and this will be, I think, it for this panel, right? Because we have a break in 10 minutes.
Yeah, so the question online is a little bit unclear to me, so I'm requesting some additional context, which I'm getting now. Okay, so this is a question from Benjamin Minard from the VFS Global. I'm quite sure who this is, but he's talking about a skill certification project which is integrated with visa management for the Maltese government, targeting 18,000 third country nationals from 45 countries to access Maltese hospitality labor market since January. And he'd be keen to share his experiences in how this can contribute to labor migration globally. So I think this is a private sector initiative, I assume.
Yeah, so maybe he can also leave his contact details if we don't have them already, so we can contact him also after the workshop. Yeah, so maybe we start with Christiane. I think
yes, all those nice hard questions. No, on the concrete examples of ILO initiatives, actually, most of what Liz was talking about are our common projects. So consider these also as ILO projects, please. Yes, we sort of take different elements in these projects. There are a lot of ILO projects as well, but I am not the point person on our skills work. So I would actually need to get back to my colleague Natalia Popova in particular, who works a lot on skills issues and also on projects on that. I think I will talk about one of the projects that we have, in a concrete one this evening, because I kept some of the things for this evening, so that you will hear some of the things again. But I try to sort of this evening to also say about exactly what we are doing now. Not only giving concrete examples, but some. And on the huge increase in trade agreements and how do we get ILO conventions in there, we are of course very pleased that there is reference now to ILO conventions. And I fully understand your sort of remark about how this is a little bit special by certain countries who have not ratified ILO conventions to encourage other countries to ratify them. But in this connection, let me say any encouragement to ratify our conventions is welcome. And certainly our conventions have sort of the aspect of also being guidance if countries have not ratified the conventions, right? You should always think about these have been negotiated in a tripartite manner, and they also provide inspiration even for countries and also for, of course, workers and employers organizations within countries that have not ratified. And for the sort of how can we encourage the EU more to put in ratifications? I think I will defer this question to you, Antonia, in the trade negotiations to then also recall to some of the EU member states that maybe it would be a good idea if they too would ratify what they want others to do. On the issue, wait a minute, on the issue of very concrete question about Bangladesh and the talent partnership there. Yes, I think, actually, I don't know exactly what's going on within this. As I said, I'm not the point person on these kinds of things, but in general, that is precisely one of the problems of the ILO with some of the talent partnership discussions that we're having, that it is very much geared at the interests of one party, very often. And so we are trying to bring this to the table, but of course, a facilitator to some extent, and not even that sometimes, but yes, it's that's a true issue with many countries, unfortunately. On the equal treatment question from Daniel and social cohesion, wait a minute.
It was the same, no? It's effect on the origin country.
It's also the, yeah, exactly. That was on the origin country. It could also be on the destination countries because that is also not always present in the thinking, right? And on the skills certification project, I defer to someone else here. I have no idea about that. Sorry.
Let me try. So I'm just trying to think exactly how best to address the question in a sense of how can we use trade agreements in a way that helps to attract talent in a way that also ensures that migrants are treated fairly, let's say. So I'm taking just of course, the perspective of the WTO. I think a couple of points maybe there. One is that these commitments that we have are for specific professions, for specific sectors, for specific skills be used in a certain way. And I would argue that they, in a way, help to avoid what you may call brain waste, to the extent that they actually provide sort of legally binding access to provide the service for which you are trained and qualified, and the investment in education has generated these skills. So in that sense, that's something that can be leveraged or should be leveraged. It hasn't as much as one would maybe hope, maybe largely a reflection of the fact that these are commitments that date back to when the WTO was created. And then, in terms of the fairness of treatment, just another point to, I think I would stress, is that in the WTO context, governments are, of course, free to impose any kind of domestic regulation they want on the, workers, be that foreign or nationals. What we are looking at is non-discrimination in two ways. One is that there is no discrimination in the sense of favoring foreigners of a certain origin over others. And then what we're looking at is for any discrimination in the sense of treating nationals more favorably than foreigners, which is something that is permitted within a certain set of restrictions that have to be inserted and indicated in each member's schedule of commitments. But for example, to give a concrete example, you know, a lot of countries impose minimum wage requirements, for example, and those are perfectly in line with our obligations, where you may have an issue of favoring nationals as opposed to foreigners. For example, if you were to impose a wage parity requirement, where you require that, you know, at some point well above the minimum wage level, that foreigners be paid as much as nationals, because to a large extent you're denying some of the comparative advantage of a foreign worker if you're setting a wage that has to be identical at a level that is well above the minimum wage. So there's a number of factors there to be taken into account. Now, to go back to the question about regional trade agreements, I think, you know, those are, you know, an exception, if you will, to the rules of the WTO. They're permitted, of course, they're meant to go deeper than what is done at the multilateral level. And in that context, you know, a lot of countries go broader, put in additional obligations, additional disciplines compared to what we have in the WTO system. And I think it's kind of, you know, flavor of the times that trade agreements are used as leverage for all sorts of other things. And I think that's there as well. Thank you.
Christiane has a two-finger.
Yes, I had a finger on the wage issue, as you can imagine. According to ILO conventions, you should have equal treatment. And so we would not be very happy about wages which are higher for nationals than for non-nationals. And in particular, I think, in some countries we even have different minimum wages for different groups of people, so that's totally out. But the argument that, you know, to take a comparative advantage, this is not something which is compatible with ILO rules. That you precisely, our organization has been created on the basis that there should be no competition between countries of member states on the backs of workers. So, and this would be a very harsh example, actually, of sort of that type of disadvantage, right? Thank you.
Very interesting topic. But I give the floor to Elizabeth.
Sorry, and I should say also where wages are far higher than the minimum wage in certain sectors, that's very often based on collective bargaining. And here again, our organization stands for the fact that migrant workers should also be incorporated in issues of freedom of association and collective bargaining. So that's an additional point where we would say, please no.
I know that we're running out of time, but quickly coming back on the talent partnerships. I do think we have to have a reflection on what was there before, and recognizing that the talent partnership is a skills and mobility partnership, the way that IOM sees it, that it comes with benefits and incentives to take workers, but also to have them return. We're in a very different place than we were 10 years ago. And the Global Skills Partnership, or the SMP model, is 10 years old. So before that, what did we have? Remittances with a triple win. The idea of brain drain was meant to be counteracting it. We have a model now that really puts skills at the front and center. And I do think that's important because it does give origin country migrants and governments a choice. And if you look at the very practical example of CAM Plus, which I talked to earlier, we actually spent quite some time talking with the government authorities of both origin countries, Morocco and Tunisia. And one important point I was making earlier was, having talked to the Moroccan authorities, it was the first time ever that not only had these authorities sat with the destination regions, because they hadn't done that before, but also it was the first time they were contemplating surplus and moving from the idea of exporting surplus workers to actually considering their own deficits. So this is a good example, in my opinion, of looking at the ways in which labour migration governance is moving towards considering both origin and destination needs. And obviously, nothing's perfect, but I think the very fact that you've got these 2 pointers now coming into play is critical. And the final point is also the migrants themselves. In an ideal SMP, migrants should be given the opportunities to work abroad, but also to use the skills that they are trained for in the origin country. So there we are talking in practice, hopefully, of a model that gives the triple win.
Excellent, wonderful. So I think we have a break now until 4:15, and then we reconvene for the second panel. It will be chaired by Yvonne.